Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to today's episode of Uncut Thread. My name is Cheryl Hills, and I'll be leading our discussion today. I'm really glad all of you are here. Now, as quilters and artists and storytellers, we know that quilting is more than just fabric, more than just thread. It's a living tradition that evolves with every generation. So today, we're going to be exploring something that sits right at the heart of our evolution. Our discussion today is about our non-traditional materials like LED threads, conductive fibers, plastics, metalworks, and digital components. Are they enhancing or distracting from serious quilt art? In order to get to today and the use of some of these newfangled gadgets and gizmos, let's take a look back to where we started before we get to where we have gotten to today. So the story of quilting has always been about transformation. It's been about taking what's available, what's cast aside, what carries memories for us or meaning to us, um, into stitching something new. Um, the idea of really using non-traditional materials like what we're going to talk about today isn't a modern intervention. It's actually been woven into the very foundation of quilt making. So I have a picture here today of a quilt that was done in the 1800s. It's basically quilting cotton. It's a shoe fly block. It's a very traditional block, traditional colors. And quilts back in that time were really functional. They weren't art quilts. They were to put on beds and to keep us warm. Additionally, quilts were made out of scraps like old clothes or flour bags or household textiles, things that have reached their useful end. But they were cultural. They were us. They were the fiber of our being. They carried the rhythms of our everyday life. And we not only turned them into work, but we turned them into beauty and we turned them into survival for us. That was the resourcefulness of that particular innovation. The next is a picture of a quilt made out of flour sack bags. And again, that's what was available. It was practical. They were obviously empty and needed to be used for functional purposes in keeping warm. Anybody recognize this quilt? This is a Gee's Bend quilt. And again, the women that quilted in Gee's Bend quilted for functional reasons, even though the quilts that they made used their old clothes, but there were memories and traditions quilted into that fabric. That's where we came from. So as time passed by, we moved from necessity to artistic expression. The makers sought new ways to add dimension to quilts and actually added their personality. So we have a picture here of a crazy quilt, and the crazy quilt kind of bridged the gap between a functional quilt and an artistic quilt. They served both purposes. They were using all kinds of scraps from fabric and clothing that you had, putting them together in different shapes, however they would fit together. So you have little pieces that are square, rectangular, diagonal lines, triangles, diamonds, and they were embellished now with thread and embroidery stitches. You may find a crazy quilt that has yarn or ribbon or lace in it. It took the functional to a slightly more elevated artistic look, but still they were used to keep warm. So, question for you. Have you ever taken a traditional quilt style or block and embellished it or used unconventional materials? If you can just put that in the chat, what you might have done. Something that I did recently in my beginning of my quilt journey over the last couple of years was I took a quilt and I used a traditional quilt block panel, the chandelier quilt, which is a very simple quilt block, and I used Ankara fabrics, non-traditional fabric for making a quilt in African fabric. And I'm still spanning the gap between loving traditional quilting and using newer textiles and fabrics, which is why Quilt Africa Tribe is the place to be, because you will be exposed to how you can incorporate these new fabrics, African fabrics, kente, Ankara, mudcloth, shwe shwe, batiks, into modern day quilting. So I'm just going to take a quick look in the chat and see if anybody has added anything non-traditional to your traditional quilting. So I have a quilt here that's been completed by our own Lisa Moore, Quilt Africa Tribe, where she has used what is becoming very commonplace now, but different fabrics. She's using African print fabrics. And she's also embellished with beadwork. Right? So using these fabrics is really sort of the reclamation and elevation of these fabrics. You know, they were non-traditional. Now they are assertion of people's heritage, their identity, and really just their own creativity. These types of quilts are now showing that quilting isn't just a domestic craft to create functional items. It's now a medium for cultural expression and social identity. So here's another quilt that is use of quilting cotton, but other mediums. If you look closely, you can see zippers in this quilt. They're not functional. They're purely artistic and decorative. You also see buttons all the way around the perimeter of this piece. This is just somebody's idea of artistic expression and using modern day items to embellish what at one time was a traditional quilt. So here is, it should be kind of familiar to most people. This is Ayanla. The pattern is Kina Tangi Dorsey's pattern for Ayanla. And this was, believe it or not, my first step into using something non-traditional to embellish a quilt. The earrings, I used a glitter gold just to do the earrings. So I'm at the beginning of my embellishing journey and using unconventional materials in a traditional quilt. Right? Another material that you can use, and if you take a look at her face is actually made of bazine, as well as her eyebrows and eyelashes. The eyelashes are actually not sewn down. They're actually three-dimensional, and they kind of flutter and face away from the quilt. So Ayanla is my first foray into embellishing and using some unconventional materials. So I'm going to ask again in the chat if you have any ideas. Our main question for today, which is, are traditional materials like these new found ones, plastics and metalwork and those type of things, do you think it enhances or distracts from serious quilt art? Okay, Nancy in the chat has also let us know that not only are African fabrics being used today, but Japanese fabrics are also being used. So you can really probably get textiles from lots of different cultures and countries and begin to incorporate those into your quilts, and they won't be the traditional quilting cottons and sometimes silks if they're used. Now, do you think that using that glitter gold in Ayanla is distracting to the piece? I'll go with a yes or no on that one. All right, Lisa says definitely enhances the quilt. Okay. So today, right, we've moved forward, and we've moved forward from fiber and adding beads and buttons and zippers to the introduction of LED threads that actually light up, using microcontrollers and conductive fibers and digital printing, laser cutting, and all types of recycled industrial materials. Just on kind of a side note, if anybody has ever watched Project Runway, they always have an episode where the designers have to make something out of unconventional materials. And they're taking balls and nets and plastic items and sewing those into clothing. Well, the same thing stands for quilting today, using lights and electronics in quilts. They give the quilt more glow, a little pulse, something that you can respond to, interact with. It kind of is beginning to bridge the gap between technology, textiles, and really tradition with futurism. These materials kind of echo the same spirit that guided early quilters, using what was available to them in their time that people thought was not conventional, using clothes and making quilts that were asymmetric because that's what you had. Now people can begin to really add futuristic type effects to their quilts. So what you're looking at right now is a project that was done by a company called Illuminate in Australia, where they got together a group of quilters who, over the course of a few days, created some quilt patterns that they were going to embellish with lights and illumination. So what you're seeing here are just it's one large quilt, but behind it there's electronics and circuitry, and the quilts are actually lit up in spots. You can see it's just sort of a first foray into pushing the boundaries and finding out what once was unconventional is now becoming accepted, and it becomes the foundation for new art. So we kind of went from feed text and now we're into these LEDs and electronic art. Okay. So here's an up close picture of a different panel that somebody created, and it has just one or two spots where the water droplets are actually illuminated from the back with lights. So this small art quilt has been enhanced with some lighting in the back. Here's another example, right? And if you take a look at this rainbow, this, I guess not rainbow, it's in the water, this arch, you can see a series of lights illuminating the back of this particular quilt design. You can also see a hand reaching up underneath to actually turn this thing on. It actually needs battery power to turn the lights on and illuminate it and turn it into art. And you also have the ability to purchase fabrics that have illumination already built into them. So you can make bigger and larger pieces that are illuminated, but is that something that you want to do? Does incorporating something like illuminated fabric add meaning to a piece, or does it distract from it? Give you a second to just give me some of your ideas in the chat. So we have a few people in the chat that are really liking the idea behind using unconventional materials. They, not necessarily for something functional, but definitely for an art quilt. It makes it just pop a little bit. Right? So some other types of fabric that I was talking about that you could use to sort of as the base of your new futuristic style quilt would be using sari fabric from India. It has gold and a few other fibers woven into it, which certainly would accept something like illumination, or even adding paper or any kind of glow in the dark. I made a Halloween quilt, and a very small portion of it was a set of eyes, and the eyes were made with glow in the dark thread. Appropriate for Halloween, maybe not appropriate for other times. So again, I'm just going to ask that question again. Do you think incorporating non-traditional materials adds to a piece, or does it distract? All right. Now, if you saw a piece that used some of these unconventional materials, would you think that it qualifies for something that should be entered into a quilt show or a guild show or a challenge? What would you say if you saw a piece like that in a quilt show or being judged at a quilt competition? So there are a couple comments in the chat. People like the idea of using lights in an art quilt, but not in a functional quilt. Let's see what else. Patty says, use items that manipulate natural light are more appealing as opposed to using artificial light, using a light bulb or something like that to illuminate your piece. Right? Okay, and we have techniques that are always changing. I think it depends on the requirements of the show. I'm always looking to push the boundaries for new things. Okay. For quilt shows and competitions, it depends on the rules. Do you think that these new quilts, these illuminated quilts, quilts with plastics and metals in them, should they have their own category in a quilt show or competition? Right? Bob would like to see those quilts in a quilt show. Um, I would love to see them also because I think, albeit they should be in a category of their own, I believe, but I think that they should be included because if you take quilts from way back in the day, people were always pushing the boundaries, always trying something new artistically. So I think that incorporating these new techniques in art quilt making makes sense to me. Okay, so let me stop sharing. And I just want to kind of work with some folks in the chat and just bring up the idea of sustainability. Do you think using some of these unconventional materials is good for sustainability? Or do you think that using LEDs and plastics is harmful and things that won't ever go away from this earth? All right. Put your answer in the chat. I'll be discussing it. So you do have some eco-friendly options, solar-powered LEDs as opposed to plugging them in, recycled plastics, another way for you to use sustainable items in your quilting. So if you've got something you might be throwing away and you can find a way to incorporate it into an art quilt, go for it. Right? What about showing an art quilt with some of these items in it in a museum? What kind of challenges does that present for a curator? Having to plug in your quilt, having your quilt on display and the batteries die, the light bulbs go out, pushing these boundaries, I think is a great idea. But the longevity of some of these pieces is probably in question just based on some of the materials that are used. And obviously, from eternity, we have art artifacts that are deteriorating every day as we speak. What are your thoughts about sustainability, longevity, being economical? I'm looking at the chat. So I think that pushing the boundaries, no matter what happens to the piece of art over time, there are pieces of art that have had very short-lived lives. What comes to mind is the piece of art in the museum that was a banana duct taped to a white background. Not going to last forever. But it was art at the moment it was created, and it was art as it began to deteriorate and change. Okay. So we have liabilities may be an issue when it comes to using LED or other lighted material in a museum. I hadn't thought of that. Right? Yeah. Yeah. If something's meant to be, it's going to last for however long it lasts. And I think that example of the banana on the white background is one of those things. We do have people restoring art, restoring quilts, patching up quilts. If you've ever watched anybody try and patch an antique quilt, it's not a perfect science, and it is what it is. So I think that as we create art, it will last however long it should last. So I just want to kind of begin to wrap up with just some comments about using unconventional materials, where we've come from, where we're going to. We all know that quilting is an evolving form of art, right? Going from those feed sacks and household scraps of fabric. Those are non-traditional materials at the time. And then we move through to bridging the gap between a functional quilt and starting to make them artistic using embellishments like the crazy quilt, where we started using our embroidery floss and special stitches in between all of the scrap fabric pieces that create a crazy quilt. We got another comment in the chat. I think some plastics could extend the life of a quilt, but it would depend on the type of plastic. As far as sustainability is concerned, some plastics can be difficult to recycle once sewn into a quilt. So that's a whole nother thing unto itself. What do you do with old quilts? Do you recycle them? Are they sustainable? What happens with that fabric? As you know, the fabric industry is a big issue when it comes to dyes and what happens to those fabrics once they get into the landfill. So what happens to our quilts? Sustainability is something to look at and think about when we're creating quilts and using unconditional materials, even though it may be sustainable. So today, we have access to all kinds of things. We have LED threads. We have conducted pathways where we can, plug things in. We can make things 3D. We now have the ability to use laser cut appliques, recycled fabrics, recycling our own clothes from denim to men's shirts. People are now making memory quilts out of a loved one's clothing. So, you can make sustainable some old fabrics from times gone by and keep that going. Okay? There are a lot of things that create art, and not necessarily being gimmicky, but things that are engaging and fun to look at. You can use those lights to open up engagement. You can make city lights, constellations in your quilts or fireflies. Um, you can use it to mimic a heartbeat or any kind of rhythm or music. Um, these things are still all evolving in art quilting, but keep in mind that they're not replacing tradition, they're just expanding upon it. Right? So even though, quilting is rooted in our heritage and, our tactile traditions and craftsmanship, and is all passed down through our generations, there's nothing like trying something new and branching out and using these LED threads, and at times putting aside how fragile the piece may be or any kind of environmental concerns or the technical complexity that may appear to shift away from that core of fabric and thread and a traditional quilt. It's now in the hands of the maker. So serious quilt art isn't novel, right? It's our new tradition. It's our future. We are taking risks and we're overshadowing some of the composition and the technique or color theory, right? We want to innovate, not just within the boundaries of traditional quilting and textiles, but we want to expand, but not abandon them. So, with that, I'm going to ask if you have any other questions or comments in the chat. And other than that, I will be closing out our discussion for today. Okay. Just checking the chat. All right, so I want to thank everyone for joining in today. I just want to reiterate that there's no right way, right material, wrong material that you can use to create your art quilt, your functional quilt, whether it's cotton or dire or LED constellation. The only thing that really matters is your voice. So let's keep telling our stories, honoring our heritage, and pushing our boundaries in ways that feel authentic to us. So I want to thank everybody for joining. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Wow, great job, Cheryl.
Oh, goodness.